Let's get started. My name is Pranav Patel, and I'm part of the company called Meditech Safe. And so it seems like you guys have a great sessions today. They're very inspiring as well as stimulating. The topic today is around cybersecurity in healthcare, especially more focused around Internet of Medical Things. And I gotta tell you this, about a week and a half ago, I was having a conversation with a healthcare professional who's been doing a phenomenal job dealing with pandemic, and I was congratulating. And he turned back and it said, Pranav, you got more work to do. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, what about all this digital virus? And quite frankly, I pause for a second. I recognize what I do, and I reflect now. And he's not too far from the reality. Just in last 2 weeks, you might have heard about several incidents, but a few that really catches attention are the first one: a woman dies during a cyber attack in German hospital. Well, obviously it's not because a device got malfunctioned or anything, but just the fact that hospital wasn't really available and a critical patient requiring a care couldn't get care on time results into a death. And people report that being the first incident, but I tell you, it's not a first incident. Literature tells you that they've actually happened multiple times. But that's not it. Just last weekend in the US, we've heard about UHS, one of the Fortune 500 and a very large hospital system, have been down and faced with a ransomware attack, and they're still scrambling to get back up. UHS was not a small organization, and they've had plenty of resources. Further, just this week alone, Cleveland Clinic, a premier health institute, also been breached, and they were down for a day. Obviously, not all of the sites, just one particular one. But this goes out to say that cyber attack don't only happen to a smaller entity or the entities with less resources, but also to a larger ones. And some of them are very, very well known. And when they happen, they don't only compromise patient data, but it leads to operational disruption and safety concerns. So that takes me to a few points, and I'll make a few points, and we'll discuss those few points through this presentation, and we'll come back to them again. The first one is current approach to cybersecurity has got to a point of diminishing return. It's a time to pause and think about this, because it's not just this incidents that we just talked about it, but within last 2 months, if you look at it, one of the largest shipping company has been breached. One of the largest automotive company, Honda, has been breached. One of the largest entertainment company, Carnival, has been breached. One of the largest food and beverage organization, Brown-Forman, has been breached. So the point being is, if the cybersecurity approaches and strategies were very robust, you would not see a day after day and news after news that highlight the cyber incidents. So we'll talk about more on that. Second, the largest opportunities are in areas of people, leadership, and culture, whereas the world is chasing cool new technologies. And we'll go more onto that. So hold that for a thought. The third one, the stakes are high in healthcare, yet the industry continues to move slow. And you'll see an evidence of it in the context of why we say that way. But obviously the disruption that we just saw on our first page goes out to say how the stakes are high. So let's first calibrate ourselves in terms of the new realities in healthcare. What do we all want? We want good access. Obviously, in an absence of access, we have patient safety concerns. We want to make sure the quality of care that we get is absolutely the best. We never want to compromise there. And the last one is we obviously want it at the lower cost. And especially in North America and the US, the discharge cost per bed is 60% higher than any other developed nation. So all these areas are very critical. And obviously there's a lot going on. And all those areas really putting pressure on healthcare providers, hospitals, doctors, offices, imaging centers, so on and so forth. And they're dealing with a few priorities, and they're juggling with them. The first one, in alignment to those three things, is new care delivery. They all want to have a financial sustainability so they continue to offer best services and care. Our needs are changing. We would not want to wait for our care for too long. We want to make sure our billing happens in the right way. We want to make sure the customer experience or the patient experience is absolutely the best. So I think all those things are very important from a provider's perspective. Digital innovation is a pretty big deal because it offers significant promises for improved care and cost. We just briefly saw about cybersecurity. And the last one, the talent, is all important. So when you look at all that things and say, look, where's the role headed and where are the opportunities, not only for providers, but also for new businesses in general. And when you sum it out, it's going to fall into one of the three buckets. Consumerism. As consumers of healthcare, we all want to really take control of what goes on. Technology management, and a talent. Without a talent and without having enough healthcare professionals, obviously care is hard to be delivered. So let's start to look at each one of it in its own way and see how they all come together. The whole landscape in healthcare is changing. New technology, new delivery model, as we said, and tech and talent all have a role to play. So let's just start with the first, calibration tool. As a consumer in this country, we directly control $330 billion worth of spend. For a very long period of time, people thought it's all done through payers, insurance companies paying for it. But with the higher deductibles, as we all have it, we control the initial, whatever the upfront payment, deductibles that we have, and that amount to almost $330 billion. So in return, we as a consumers affect 61% of all healthcare spending. So the days where providers dictated are far gone. As consumers, we have choices, and as a consumers, we all direct that spend. As a result, the whole consumerism concepts really taking place, and providers are adjusting. As you look at what's happening in terms of a landscape, look where the growth is. The growth is not really into a hospital setting. It's actually onto a distributed care setting, such as primary care. You have a technology that helps you, such as telemedicine, on-site clinics, dialysis clinics, home health. They're becoming the areas of growth, urgent care, and places like that. And that's where the new care is going to get delivered more and more and more of that. We'll see that as an evidence. If you look at all the retail stores, the supermarkets, today, almost 80% of the supermarkets have pharmacy. And 42% of the supermarket brands either have it, or they're piloting, or they've actually declared to have retail clinics. Pause for a second. The role like a Walmart, they used to really do only retail. Now they're actually becoming a healthcare storefront for most part. And what do they want? They want consumers to come to a storefronts, and healthcare is the best way. And as a consumer, our 14% of spend is in healthcare. So it's a great way for them to capture. And that changes the dynamic, right? If you look at the growth over the 5 years between 2013 to 2017, significant amount of growth has been realized into the retail sectors. And we want to go there for our basic primary care, immunization, minor illnesses, headache, lab test, preventive health screening. So when you extrapolate that and you start to see what are the feasible areas where, these retailers who are good at doing high volume, low cost can impact is primary cares, labs, dental, and many of the health screening activities that utilizes a lot of medical devices such as x-rays, bone densitometry, mammograms, ultrasound. They all can be done. And very recently you've seen Walmart has gone pretty big on it. Kroger, Winn-Dixie, all of these places are making a dent. And that also changes the dynamic for healthcare providers, especially hospitals. So what are they doing? Look, hospital systems are realizing the few things. Number one, they want to retain a patient for the full life cycle. They want to think about each patient, and they want to think about what the life cycle revenue and the value to be had, starting from a toddler to as the person grows, gets into adulthood, and eventually end of life. The full life cycle and the care needed across the life cycle differs, as you can tell, right? Starting from vaccination in initial phases to just regular health screening or maybe sport-related injury, to later on you actually have more complexity, and towards the later part in your life, the complexity, unfortunately, from various chronic diseases could only increase. So as a result, health systems are becoming IDNs, integrated delivery network. They have the hospitals, which is the center of universe, and then they're doing either partnerships or they're acquiring, so that now they can offer pharmacies to ambulatory surgery centers. They're also partnering in many ways with the retailers, and we'll talk about in a second, where Publix, which is a large retailer in South, has done a partnership to provide telehealth with health systems such as Beaumont Health and others. They're buying physician practices often. Imaging centers are integrated. So the whole world is changing. Now care cannot be taught just in hospital, but also at different setting. Well, what does that mean when it comes to a technology and the term we thought about in terms of IoMT? We'll get to that. Well, here's the first part. What we want to make sure as that happens is this person is James. Assume now that James, from his whole life cycle, has various treatments that happen. You want to make sure all that record in the medical record is stored, right? So that information is not only coming when James was young, as he's growing in his life cycle, but also all the information is coming from different domains. In the pharmacies, all the kind of drugs that he's had over the life cycle till that point, lab results that he's actually had and the trending on the lab results, blood, clinical aspects, just in case if there were some acute needs. But most of the times, most of the diagnostics, 70% of diagnosis relies on to lab results. So what's happening in terms of that is you have to connect all this information, continue to gather all this information from those different domains, as you saw, right? Different care settings, continue to maintain that information. Now, when you have a good information and good data, that's when you can run very sophisticated algorithms, such as AI algorithms, machine learning, and now get them to provide decision support for clinicians. And I could give you a nice little use case where you can have somebody who is a high, who has hypertension, potentially could have wearable at home that's actually sending data in terms of blood pressure, slur speech, things like that. And as those things change, you have a dramatic increase in, let's say, blood pressure, or your speech is deteriorating. Your physician can remotely monitor it, and they can diagnose this through telehealth. And as this information, as the health deteriorates, he could actually prescribe or dispatches ambulance to take the patient to maybe a potentially for imaging, and once from the imaging, if needed, can be taken to an acute care for some sort of a surgery. So now you can save a patient, right? So full life cycle, if you think about it, could start from home to physician doing a remote telehealth, to emergency vehicle providing care on a timely basis, to imaging center, to a surgery. All that connectivity is what's really happening. And as you think about connectivity in that, you have all kinds of things. You have devices, you have tasks, you have imaging, all bring it together. And that is the role in a healthcare now. And we refer to that Internet of healthcare things or Internet of medical things. And the goal is, as you have this information, you could think about potential problems, precision medicine, ahead of the time. Now, this results could give James health ahead of the time and say, James, you gotta be doing this X, Y, and Z from preventative basis. That's the nirvana. That's where healthcare is headed when you think about digital innovations in a healthcare space. But it's not two separate things, right? It's actually all these things comes together to get you this strategy. Now, what it's doing is actually building new kind of networks. You have your traditional IT things that connecting to the Internet of Medical Things, right? So if you look at this figure, in general, what you have is you can have medical devices such as CT scan, or you can have biosensors, or you can have your implanted pacemakers, for example. All that information is getting connected, getting stored. You are having a telemedicine type of applications, and clinicians are looking at the information. And on IT side, you're managing that from population health, personalized medicine, so on and so forth. Is this just a hypothesis or is it real? Well, here are a couple of examples. If you just look at what happened during the pandemic, Cincinnati Children's Hospitals, telehealth, in full 2019, they did about 2,000 telehealth visits. Their hope was to get to 5,000 telehealth visits in a full year, still a few years away. Just as the pandemic hit, they're actually doing 5,000 telehealth visits every week. Such a drastic change. Very similarly, if you think about Smith & Nephew, that's a large implantable orthopedic device manufacturer, and now they're actually making more and more solutions. They have launched products. It's a wearable products for people who come from an operations in a post-operative settings. You want to monitor the patients from a therapy, if the therapy is happening in the right way, or they're falling, or their posture is maintained in the right way through wearable technology. And that is happening in a home as well as rehabilitation centers, and it takes the data and sends it to the clinicians, right? So it's not a hypothesis, it's actually happening in a real time. So IoMT is not a concept, it's actually here. Now, complexity is quite high. It sounds simple, but hopefully as you think about in all care settings that we just discussed, right? Start from a hospital area and how complex that environment has become, or actually environment becomes, is representative here. In a hospital, you have surgical centers, beds, all these diagnosis devices. They're all connected through this very complex setting. So it's a very complex architecture there. You could go into an ambulatory center where you actually think about operations where you have robotic surgery takes place, you have visualizations devices, you have lightings that's necessary, and they're all connected through a network. Now you would say, well, that makes sense, but what about retail? Here's the retail. Today you could walk into this is an example of Publix. You could walk into a Publix for $50. You'll get connected through this nice little telehealth booth with a with a Beaufort Health or a Baycare, and a physician there would actually provide you a consultation. You also have robotic pharmacy dispensers, you have health centers. So even you go into a clinic, so you have all the systems that are really connected together. Now you come into a home. In a home, that this is what Best Buy is offering. Yeah, Best Buy does have offering now through a few acquisition for people to manage health at home, where if they have devices that do a passive monitoring of the patients, provides emergency response, medication management through connectivity and standard devices. Now pause for a second and you say, wow, now you have networks that spread across a lot of settings, and all of them could potentially collect the data about you and store it at one level. And that reflection is very important to really understand the implications from a cybersecurity perspective. So now understand that network, that Internet of Medical Thing network, and how important it is to manage the environment from a network perspective. what if the network is down? What if something goes wrong with it? What are the implications? So let's take, this is what happened about 2 years ago. Some of you might have actually seen in the news. University hospitals, 4,000 in the fertility clinic, 4,000 eggs and embryos were lost. Well, how did that happen? I think that question is good to really get a sense of what are the problems that could happen if Internet of Thing application is not managed. So let's take a pause. What was happening is, what you do is, you in the fertility clinic, you actually have this freezer which keeps the temperature very low, and that's where you actually store all these eggs and embryos. And what you want to make sure is it always stays at the right temperature level. To make sure, now this freezer had some technical issues. So what did the hospital do, or the clinical engineering team do? Is they actually built an IoT application. And what that is they put a sensor and says, look, as soon as the temperature drops, it would actually send an alert to a technician. So now the technician knows the temperature is dropped into the freezer. He or she would come, add more nitrogen to it, so that temperature comes back to the right level. Okay, very simple and sounds very smart, right, from a preventative basis. So now what happens is, in one fine weekend, temperature drops. Apparently, the alert does not go to a technician. As a result, technician doesn't know. And when it comes back on a Monday, you realize that it was actually down for the whole weekend, and 4,000 embryos and eggs were destroyed. Well, there are implications, and the news report showed that there's some people who probably their only chance to have kids was just this, because they couldn't really, because of the cancer, they couldn't really get pregnant again, and so on and so forth. So very devastating outcome. Now that's what happens. So if you think about that network, when you start to rely on that network, and if that network doesn't work for one reason or other reason, now you have a significant patient safety concerns. So yes, the technology can drive great quality and reduce care and make life easy. You also have to make sure there's enough redundancy built into it. There's enough technology backup plans built into it, right? So that if one area didn't work, you're still not risking it all. And that's the implication you have to think about. And now, what if there was a cyber attack? We just saw in a first chart, right, that whole IT network was down. Now imagine there could be many systems like this. If these systems were down for multiple reasons, how great of an impact would that be on people and patients in a patient's care? Take a same example. This is also not a fictitious example. A few years ago, WannaCry attack happened, and this is a radiology system. Due to ransomware, the screenshot showed up asking for ransom at the given Bitcoin by a certain time to be delivered. Otherwise, the systems, this critical medical device, remains unfunctional. Now, okay, this was a radiological system and there was no patient, but imagine in the middle of the surgery, if something like that happened, what could that lead to? Devastating. Well, here's the bad news, right? When you start to look at different hospital settings that we've seen, it wouldn't be surprising, and I think most of the people would admit, or probably would acknowledge, that almost roughly 40 to 50% of these medical devices tend to be vulnerable to cyber attack in multiple different ways. And this would be at least that percentages. It could be much higher. This is a challenge when you think about cybersecurity in a healthcare setting, especially when you have connected medical devices. Okay. So how could, this is a topic around how could these devices be breached? Obviously, there are multiple different attack vectors you can think of it. We just put a few here as an example. So for example, sometimes people, you may see a collateral damage. The WannaCry attack was not targeted to medical devices or to particular the radiology system. It was a collateral damage in the sense, you have this malwares in the wild, and if the vulnerabilities that you have in your devices match with them, you're going to get infected, right? Not targeted, but just because you kept those devices vulnerable and there was an attack, you become victim. That could be a very targeted attack where an attacker could really look for all the devices that are on a particular network that are vulnerable. And once they find one that they can attack, they really go and make an attack. That could be scenarios, and we've seen that in one of the ransomware event happened to a hospital in Indiana where a user credential to that particular device was compromised. And the way it actually happened was, that devices was being remotely monitored by the manufacturer, and apparently and the engineer at the manufacturer had saved the credential into into the cookies so that they don't have to remember that. Well, the bad actors got into the cookies, got that, used that, and ran the ransomware to the whole health system. This could happen just when you're in a proximity, and it's called spoofing, where the device is talking to other system, and you're actually thinking that you could make the system to think that it's talking to an authentic system versus you're mimicking that and not taking control of that and really running a cyber attack. Sniffing is a very similar way. You can think of most of these medical devices probably communicate, and many of them communicate through unencrypted protocols. So sometimes you can actually get into deep level inspection and get a lot of information around the devices, or sometimes you have a patient data in there as well. So there's just a handful of examples. That could be many. I mean, theft, somebody can literally take a device and walk away. So the point being here is, and you think about an environment, especially that's actually getting very spread from hospital settings to some ambulatory settings to home. How often do we think about when we have elderly at home who are probably have pacemakers or some other wearables? How often do we think about our network, home network, being vulnerable and keeping an impact? And how often even the healthcare providers who've given you the devices are thinking the security and safety of those devices so that they can ensure there are no other patient harm. So there are a lot of questions that come about as you start to think about how to address this particular area. And when it comes to really addressing IoMT, it's very important for us to understand two different areas and priorities that differ into two, right? The IT side is all around data security, right? What you care is your data should not get exposed to somebody else. So your confidentiality of the data, the integrity of data is very important. And sometimes when the ransomware event happens, obviously the whole network can be down and availability is of the question. But your priorities are, first, I want to protect the data. However, when you come into the Internet of Medical Things, imagine this baby, right? Your priority is not the social security number, saving a social security number or a record of this baby. Your priority is making sure these devices don't malfunction. The safety is a priority. Availability of the system is a priority, more so than integrity and even the confidentiality. And an outcome of incidents is different of magnitude, right? Here, an average cost per record is $400. An average cost for an adverse event would be $300,000. So, the strategy in the IT side, you could easily say, look, I want to monitor the network and I want to detect if there is some malicious behavior, and I want to respond quick to contain, because, okay, fine, I compromise maybe 10 records, right? That's what, 10 times $400? I'm just making it up. That's $4,000. You don't want to say, oh, I'm going to compromise, for patient safety. That's very hard. So here, when you think about Internet of Medical Things, your prevention-based approach is extremely important, is more so important than detecting and quickly containing. And getting the head around those two differences is very essential when it comes to figuring out approach and a strategy for for many of the systems, if you will. So what's the current state? I made 3 bold statements at the beginning of the presentation. And I think this is about time to really going back and connecting the dots onto those three statements that I made, right? The first one, so let's look at what happens today. The typical cybersecurity approach in every organization, or most of the organizations that I've said, relies around a few principles: centralization and standardization using very, very advanced technologies, right? We all like the buzzwords around, can we use AI and machine learning in a cybersecurity? Sure, I think it's very valuable. But that's a technology. But let's look at that first, right? So if you think about this approach, what do you really have? Most of the organizations, not every employee is waking up in the morning and thinking about cybersecurity, right? We're thinking that there is a group, there's a centralized group. We call them IT, network engineering or information security team. And usually they're taking care, and they are for years and years, and even now, they're fighting a toughest battle every day. They're probably most overworked people because this is what they're trying to manage every day. But it's a very centralized team, right? And when you look at their approach and their tool sets, obviously there are a lot, but key one is they want to make sure that they use more and more standardized tools to be able to use around different hospitals, sites, or maybe different ambulatory settings or home health settings. And they revolve around, first of all, do I have a good perimeter controls, which is firewalls or access management, user credentials, and things like that. The next one they want to have is SOC or NOC, that stands for Security Operations Center or Network Operations Center, where you have a group of people that continuously monitoring all the things that are happening into a network. And as soon as something goes wrong, they detect it and they respond it. Again, remember the word detecting and responding more so than preventive. Obviously, perimeter control is preventive. We're not saying that there is no prevention, but it would change. The next one, they want to quarantine different sectors, right? They're thinking, oh, this is a high value asset, or this could have a lot of criticality. Can we quarantine them? Can we segment them? And can we treat them separate? So if one is entered into one segment, they don't go and hack into the other one or penetrate the other segment, if you will. They want to have a very sophisticated intrusion detection system, or they call it threat hunting system, where they're creating a honeypots and sort of a game theory if somebody is trying to really get into honeypots, but that's not really separate. So all that fancy tools and technologies that they're trying to deploy, next generation firewalls, so on and so forth. But overall, when you look at that, there's a heavy focus on, can I detect a breach fast enough, and can I contain? And it's not wrong. It actually is pretty good way. But as we said, right, there's so many things that you can do. And let's look at the data to see the effectiveness of it. Because they're doing this pretty good job in this left-hand hand, what you see overall breaches that have taken place, only about 14% of breaches are attributed to hacking and malware. The reason that number would have been very high, but the reason it's low is because a good job has been done as best as they can be done at the network level. The next open problem you have is 86% of incidents you can attribute to some level of human factor. Either somebody's making an error, or there is somebody inside of an organization that's misusing the privileges that they've had, or they're becoming victim of some sort of social engineering, or there's a physical theft, right? It's not a small percentage. When you think about 86% of the problems are attributed to the human factor. Now take it to the right. The first thing when we think about cybersecurity, we're thinking, oh my God, there's some bad actors, maybe offshore, that are attacking us. Sure, they are. And I think we're doing a good job. Our centralized overworked team is doing a great job of minimizing that. But when you start to look at the next element, is almost 60% of the times you have insiders at play or a partner at play. So the whole culture of security, right, is very important to address the 70% of that actors that cause cyber incidents. Now, that's not to say our employees or the internal people are bad. No, not at all. Not all of them have malicious intent. There can be many innocent mistakes. I just don't know that I needed to change a password. I thought I would do it later, or I didn't know if I shared it with somebody else, would share it with somebody else, or oh, I just walked away and left my screen open. I could just kind of go on and on and on. There was not a bad intent, but just because they're not aware, they're not part of the whole thread of understanding the implications, those things happen all the time. So now you have this situation where you have a centralized approach that's done as well as it can, but then everything else is really falling apart from inside, right? That needs to be addressed. And think about how difficult would it be? How difficult would it be for somebody sitting at a central location to think about potentially a network that he or she may not fully be able to monitor or control, maybe in the ambulatory settings where there is some sort of a partnership, or maybe at home where you may choose to disconnect some things or connect some things, or they may not even have full access, and events can take place. So what do we see, right? The complexity is high, number one. Number two, the implications when it comes to medical devices from a safety and well-being is very high. And number three, our toolkits have evolved with technology, but they still revolve around more centralization, if you will, than the open areas that's still available. So now let's go back to the points that we first discussed. Current approach to cybersecurity has got to a point of diminishing return. We can add more and more technologies, but that's very still fully centralized. What we also need to address in healthcare is that decentralized approach. You want to have people who are touching those devices, right, be very well aware of the implications that happen. So for example, when you think about a simple medical device, you have many people touching them, and then many people can really impact it. You have patient, you have relatives, you have clinicians, you have technicians, all that could impact a device at the endpoint level and infect it, and that could really proliferate. Sometimes we think, oh my God, it's just a small low device, it's not a high value asset. But if it's vulnerable, it could be a gateway to a high value asset. So thinking that whole network is very difficult, and now decentralization has to be a priority. Otherwise, we'll continue to see high valued cyber incidents that we've seen in this last few months, and continue to see it, and it wouldn't stop, right? So hopefully we proved our first point well with an example. The second one, the largest opportunities are in areas of people, leadership, and culture, whereas the world is chasing cool new technologies. Right? You saw the data around how much human factor is involved. We saw the data around how many internal players and partners are involved. Yet, when we go speak to an organization, who's really in charge, if you think? Pause for a second. You'll come up with a lot of names, but at the end of the day, most of your effort are network and cybersecurity engineering-led efforts. These guys are phenomenal. They're smart. They're technically savvy. But we all have our own occupational biases, right? If I'm an engineer, very likely I'm going to try to find an engineering and technology-centric approach. And they've done that. They've progressed the technology. They've put it into it. But all that people-centric part is missing. So what you really need is you need a business leadership-led or business leadership managed approach, right? Today, the chief information security officers are taking more and more active roles, and many organizations have them, many more don't, but they're still more or less acting as internal consultants. So organization 101 would say, you know what, let's make them more than just the consultants, because consultants sometimes may or may not have full autonomy, they may have accountability, but not full authority or an empowerment to be able to impact. And even if they had it, right? Imagine a chief information security officer to go to a clinician and said, look, I want to actually keep that USB port open. And the clinician says, well, I need that I need that USB port open. Sorry, the CISO would say, I want it closed, and he may say, I want it open because that's important part of my clinical workflow. Now that dialogue is very important, and the clinicians may not get the perspective unless he is fully engaged and understood the complications, right? So what you need is, you need to have the whole organization be part of it, and CISOs have to be more than just the consultants. They have to be empowered to think very holistically, business-wide, to be able to address this, this topic. The third one, the stakes are high in healthcare, yet the industry continues to move slow. What do I mean by that? Well, we just saw, you know, UHS, 250 plus hospitals have had some sort of an impact just within a week, right? We heard that just because the care cannot be delivered to a patient died in Germany, and I'm sure here other complications could happen. So stakes are high, and hospitals and healthcare entities are being attacked on a daily basis. However, when you compare that to, let's say, what banking or defense sector has done, you know, we haven't pushed the elements as strongly as we need to. Banking with the FFIEC and defense with CMMC, they've actually created regulations, and organizations have to comply to that, and it focuses on two elements. Number one, they ask them to think about cybersecurity very holistically, not just technically network-centric, relatively, you know, siloed, if you will, in many ways. But think about all the elements that are important, number one. Number two, they ask them to mature those practices. It's not just one guy does or one group does it somewhere in a corner. Everybody has to be included so that those processes and the practices are matured. Versus in healthcare, you know, I bet FDA released guidelines. It's a guidelines, not a compliance. And not many healthcare providers, in our view, fully even understand those guidelines, let alone executing them to deliver that. So there's an element that needs to be done from healthcare and governance side of it to say, look, you know, we just got to push it a little more because the implications are high. And until that's done, the standardization in terms of how to manage cybersecurity will not take place, if you will. So, you know, just keep those three things in mind. I think those are apparently they're bold statements, but there are reasons for those bold statements. And you know, that was my last chart. Obviously, happy to answer any questions that you may have. Now I get a chance to see what I have on a screen, by the way. So great. I am I'm looking at the questions, and I'm going to try to answer them. The resolution doesn't fit the screen. Sorry, I missed that. Do you believe that telehealth will continue to remain in high demand after pandemic precautions end? Will it be the new normal? You know, I think telehealth, it would have taken a little longer time, but I think we've actually passed the chasm. People becoming more and more you know, comfortable with it to a certain degree, and it's going to depend on high complexity of a problem that you have to have a resolution on, and how comfortable you are with your provider. So I think as long as those things would work, we think it could work on. But just keep two things in mind, right? You know, the FDA in general would say, when a clinical data moves bidirectional through the network, you want to treat the network at least as a class 1 medical devices, right? I'm not sure we're actually treating all that in that fashion. So you have to know what clinical data goes bidirectional, and those things would evolve. But, you know, I don't think we're going to go back. It may vary by case basis, if you will. We have seen even Zoom is having issues securing their online meetings. How can this be improved in ad hoc solutions used by different medical providers? I think you know, I answered the question. I think you also answered it very well. We've used it because there was a need and there was nothing else. You know, but exactly those are the type of things we need to think about it. But the first part of it is, we could only think about those things, right, when we're aware of it. So you have to be a little more paranoid. You have to ask those questions. And even when you get into this session, you want to ask them, hey, look, do you have other people who are, you know, around you, right, who may be listening to the conversation, because it may or may not be private. You have no idea. Or, you know, how you're carrying this information. And then obviously security of whatever the mechanism that we use is pretty critical. So good question. Hopefully I was able to answer that. Other thoughts, other questions that I could probably address? Yeah, and you can, feel free to, are security devices vendors open to improving cybersecurity? That's a fantastic question. Look, when we talk to organizations at both end, medical device guys, as well as the healthcare guys, this is what's happening, right? And they're both right in their own perspective, because look, the providers would say, the medical device guys should think about cybersecurity because I'm buying it from them, and I think that's true, right? There is an element of things that device manufacturers have to ensure, such as, is there enough good design for security built into it? Are they managing cybersecurity or life cycle, in the sense, are they releasing patches fast enough and they're making it available and all those sort of things, right? So those are the elements. There is that level of work that medical device manufacturers must do. They can't walk away from their accountability perspective, right? It's the product safety element. But the other element of it from a provider perspective is also true. Medical device manufacturer can say, look, I did this device, I built these features for your need. Now you're taking my devices, putting into your network and operating that. I don't control that. Are you keeping it into a flat network? Are you keeping it into a segmented network? Are you sharing the passwords? There are a lot of elements that you guys can do, and you're doing it, that you got to do, right? So the point being is both parties have a role to play, and rather than this, now they're all coming together and they're actually trying to address it, but obviously it's not the easiest thing to be done. So great question, Shalan. I hope I was able to address it. And the question is, are they open to, there are trade-offs. Look, they're the business people, there are resources that they have to devote to, and they have to think about their business case, and they have to think about the return on their investment. For that, do I put those engineering resources in doing that work, or do I put those engineering resources in creating next generation of devices? Those are the trade-offs they have to make, but they are leadership level decisions and trade-offs that they have to be mindful of, and it varies from an organization to organization, if you will. Hopefully answers your question. Thank you. So if there are no other questions, I would say if you visit Meditech Safe, we have a section called Knowledge Center. And in that, there are a bunch of articles, but those articles will take you, they're relatively broad. They'll take you from not only on aspects of cybersecurity, but also some of aspects of an organization, of how the organization have to be evolved to really support that, to also some thoughts around, what do we think about applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning and maturity of it. A lot of those things are there, open at your disposal. Have a look at them. And over the period of time, if there are any things that I can answer, feel free to reach out. I think the contact is available, and happy to get engaged. But hopefully you found this discussion to be useful. Okay, one, is it safe to say that when explaining to clinical technician the importance of securing medical devices, that the purpose is to save lives and not to increase device complexity? Good question. I think end of the day, everybody else, I've talked to a lot of people who are on the medical device manufacturing side, clinical engineering side, technicians. They all get into the field first and foremost because they love the patient care and saving lives. So I think that part is just there. The things that get mixed over the period of time is the complexity of an organization, and people forget it. So I think reminding them that this is important, and not just saying it because they probably also acknowledge that, but also helping them, supporting them, resourcing them, being part of it, and recognizing that effort is also good leadership and actually close the loop. So I would say, yes, the goal is not to increase the device complexity. And quite honestly, you don't have to do complex designs, right? You have to start with a basic hygiene, good processes, practices, and really build from that. But if you communicate that patient safety, this is all for patient safety, driving quality of care, reducing cost of care, I think they're all aligned. And then we just got to also support them in any ways that we can and resource them, if you will, Peter. Hopefully, just my perspective. Excellent. Thank you. Great. So guys, fantastic sessions. I'm looking forward to other sessions as well. Some of them have been very inspirational, very thought-provoking, and I think to the organizers, this is hats off to you. Great, and looking forward to other sessions. And please, if there are any questions or like to connect, let's do it offline, and please feel free to reach out. Thanks.